Hello, this is Lisa, your host of Unexplained Arkansas, the podcast. And in this episode is our big 70 episode. 70. Like, wow. I really cannot believe it. It's crazy. So, feels just like yesterday was the first. Aw. And if you haven't heard our very first episode, go back and listen. It was the Galloway Gertie, the ghost of Harding. I think. I don't remember what we named it. But anyway, it is a good one. So this is going to be a two-parter. I am going to release part 1 Monday and then part 2 Thursday. So you'll get everything next week, and then I'm going to go on to a new episode the following Monday. So, bonus. Just really quick business. Remember to email or message me to reserve your seat for the live show on February 8th. We still have plenty of seats, but they are going. So if you really feel like you want to go, make sure to reserve with me. Or, you can just go on Cash App. It's like Cash App, Unexplained Arkansas. Send the money. I'll definitely let me know your email address, and then I will send you a confirmation. So, anywho. And also, if you wish to support the podcast, please go join our Patreon. You can reach the Patreon, like there's links in our references, and then also you can purchase merch on our website. So definite ways to support us. Free ways to support us as always is listen, share, like, subscribe, all the things. And also, I love to hear from everybody on Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger. I'm on TikTok, YouTube. You can leave comments, nice ones, hopefully. Or you can email me, unexplainedarkansas@gmail.com. So I love to hear from you guys. You always send the best content. And in fact, this Tony Alamo episodes was given to me actually from my good friend Taylor. So shout out to Taylor. I love you, and these episodes are for you. So this was her request. And it's been very interesting. I'm very not cool with Tony Alamo and everything he did, but it has been extremely fascinating. So anyway, so we're going to dive in. So basically, and I am by myself, and it's not as weird as it once was, I guess. So Tony Alamo would spend 40 years or so. He would be assaulting his followers in various ways, fighting the government, and using Christianity as his front. He was an evil man, but let's go to the very beginning. And we're also going to talk about his wife, who was very much a part of the ministries, especially between the 60s and 1982. So we'll get into it. So Tony was born September 20th, 1934, and his real name was Bernie Lazar Hoffman, and he was born in Joplin, Missouri. So his father's name was Bernard Hoffman. His father was born in Romania, and his mother was Lillian, and she was born in Michigan. So Lillian was actually 21 years younger than Bernard. I thought that was interesting. And then Tony had a younger brother named Daniel, and he was just a year younger than him. So Bernard in the 1940s, when Tony was around 5, was listed as working for a company called the Building Construction and is listed as an interior decorator. And I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that was a common job, but this was 1940. So I don't know. His family was Jewish. I guess his dad was Jewish. And according to Tony, and I will say according to Tony, because throughout his life, he was known to lie about his own background, his own importance. I guess he really fudged a lot during his lifetime. So this is just kind of according to him. But he said that at age 9, he was abandoned by his parents, I guess, and sent to Father Flanagan Boys Town, where he stated he was abused for being Jewish. So he kind of would end up renouncing his Jewish heritage and converting to Christianity, but he also would spend a lot of time kind of, in his quote unquote ministry, kind of looking down or having anti-Catholic sentiment. So, and I'm guessing from his alleged days at the Father Flanagan's. And again, there is honestly not a whole lot written about him and his early life. I had to find and dig a lot in Ancestry to find anything. So, anywho, I did look up this so-called Flanagan Boys Town, and there is a place listed as Boys Town Father Flanagan in Nebraska, and that was founded in 1917 and is actually still in operation. So evidently he would, like Tony would state later in life, that his father was actually a dance instructor who worked for Rudolph Valentino. And I know that name sounded kind of familiar, but I don't know. So I looked that up, and evidently Rudolph was a very popular Italian actor. So again, I don't know if that was Tony's just thing or whatever. And I'm calling him Tony. Again, he's, his real name was Bernie. So according to the census, Tony, who was still going by Bernie legally in 1950, was living in an industrial school, which was a state reformatory in Montana. And he was listed as being a juvenile delinquent, and he was 15 at that time. So I'm at a loss. So these are facts that I could find. In 1954, there is a record in Montana that shows Tony, and again, still going by Bernie, is married to a girl named Shirley. And it does look like they have a son named Gary Ray Hoffman, and he only lived for 17 hours. And he was born December 12th, 1953. So Tony would have been maybe 18, 19 at the time of this happening, and that's so sad. So I hate that. It does say on his birth certificate what he passed from, but it is totally illegible. And I don't know why. Like some of the old birth certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, like they show like typed information, but then some of the things are written and they use the most illegible cursive ever. It's like they get the person with the worst, penmanship to fill these things out. Like that makes no sense to me. But anyway, I could not read it. And I have horrible handwriting, so I'm very good at reading my own, but man, I could not read it. So it does say that Gary, little infant Gary, was buried in Billings, Montana. So he's still in Montana at this point. And again, he's 19. So a little side note, I did look up Shirley. So she ends up being remarried to another person by 1956. And then she would live until she was 2003. It looks like she kind of remained in Montana and was a caregiver by the occupation. But there was no record of her and Tony's divorce. But clearly they were done and divorced, because she was remarried in 56. And so I'm assuming that they filed a real divorce back then. So anyway, by 1961, Tony is going by Tony. He is 26 years old. He gets married to a 16-year-old named Joanne Johnson. And on his marriage license, this is so very Tony, he lists his mother's name accurately, but he lies about his father and states that his father's name, and this is on his marriage license, is Antonio Alamo, which is, we know that's not true. So the license does show that him and Joanne are living in Ohio, but are getting married in Virginia. Go figure. So his occupation is listed as a singer, and some articles stated by the age of 21 that Tony had been in trouble by this time for statutory rape, theft, burglarizing, but it also stated that he was already living in California. So I'm not really sure what is accurate on that, or if that perhaps is, why he was in the reformatory in Montana, but obviously he was not out in California during that time. So that's a little confusing. And again, there wasn't a whole lot of information in his early years prior to the ministry years. So who knows? And he certainly never told the truth about himself. So there's that. So by 1963, Tony and Joanne were divorced or headed that way, or at least, whatever. And the reasoning listed on their divorce decree was gross neglect of duty. And the decree was filed in Ohio. That sounds about right for Tony. According to the documentary that I watched on Alamo, by the early 60s, he was living out in Hollywood. He was trying to make it big as a singer, like what was listed on his marriage license. And he would tell people that he had a hit record under the name Mark Abad, which is, he did have a record under that name. And evidently it was produced in 1964, and he would claim it was a hit record. It was called Little Yankee Girl. And then he would also tell people at different times of his life that he managed big acts like the Beatles, the Doors, and the Rolling Stones, which he did not. So, he was kind of definitely an exaggerator, definitely really, So he lied. Anyway, in 1965, Tony meets up with Edith Opal Horn, and this is her legal name. At least at that time. But she was going by Susan Lipowitz when she met Tony. So she was kind of a lot like Tony. And then, of course, she was Susan Alamo once they got married. But I'm going to call her Susan. But like Tony, she's into all these aliases. So they were one... Anyway, they're very alike in that fact. Susan was born in 1920, or at least she sometimes stated she was born in 1920, in Alamo, Arkansas. Her mother's name was Geneva Jenny McAllister Horn, and then her father was Samuel Edward Horn. It says that Susan, like even on Ancestry, one of her family members had written in that she had a twin sister, Edna. There is nothing to support that, and I did find Susan's birth certificate, which we'll get into, but there was nothing to actually support that they were twins, and they were not twins. And even in the census records, their ages are never listed as the same. Additionally, and like I said, upon looking at all the records, there's huge discrepancies on Susan's birth year. And then I did finally find her birth certificate, and it did say for sure she was not a twin. So there you go. So not sure why they listed her as a twin with Edna. She was her sister, but legally, it looked like Edna was born in I think it was 1923, and officially Susan was born in 1922. So again, it states she was born in 1920. It stated that she was a twin. Both of those things were not true once I found the birth certificate. But Susan would tell stories of actually being abandoned by her father. However, it looks like her dad did die when she was 2 years old of tuberculosis. So, he didn't abandon the family, but he did pass away. And then her mother, was left to raise, the children on her own. And I could not see definitively that her mother, Jenny, got remarried. But anyway, so she did. He was actually only 24 when he died. So that's horribly sad. And this would have been in the year 24. So anyway, this leads me into something else. But by 1936, Susan married her first husband, and I say first husband, and his name was Thomas Brown. And she was listed as being 16. And they were pregnant. They had a son kind of immediately there. His name was Charles Edward Brown. So she was actually 14. So she did fudge everything on those documents to say she was born in 1920. So in my head, I think for some reason, she wanted to be 16. I don't know if there was a legal reason behind that or whatever, but it looks like she was probably pregnant, married Thomas, and she was really 14 when all this went down. So, yes, and the marriage license and the census of that time frame both said 16. And again, we know from the birth certificate that that was not factual. Furthermore, this is another weird thing. Her actual mausoleum and her death, because she does die eventually, it states on her actual burial in her mausoleum that she was born in 1925. So it's like in the early years of her life, she was fudging to make herself older, but in later years, she was fudging to make herself younger. So I don't know if that's what she had told Tony originally when she met him, that she was born in 1925, just because he was so much younger. I don't know. That is very interesting. And if you're related to these people, please, yeah, I would love to know. But no one, their relations, no one said anything about that. So anyway, I don't know if they even knew, because there was just so much lying about the age, or just, yeah, fudging on all those facts. So anyway, so Thomas and Susan didn't really make it very long as a couple, because by 1940, Susan was actually living back at home, and it was like her mother, and then Edna, her sister, and her sister's family, and her sister's son. And then Charles was living with them, and he was 2 at that time in 1940. But by the next census, it shows that Charles was living with Thomas, and he was 12. So he ended up not being raised by Susan. He ended up going to live with Thomas and being raised with Thomas and Thomas's new wife. And I have to say that was probably for the best. And in fact, in all the coverage that I found about Susan, nothing was ever mentioned about her having a son. There will be mention of a daughter, but not a son. So take that for what it is. But maybe Charles kind of, I don't know, got the better end of that stick, I hope. So yes, in 1940 now, she was going by the name of Sue Brown. So she had dropped, I guess she never liked Edna Opal, and then she had dropped the last name, and so it's now Sue Brown. So Susan's going by Sue Brown. She does get married to her second husband, and his name was Solomon Lipowitz. And they were married in Arizona, but it does state that they were like living in Los Angeles. So I don't know about that, but Solomon is listed as a bartender, and he's 29, and then Susan is listed as being 21, but really she's 18, because remember, she's still fudging about her age there. And again, I don't know why the lying of the age is still going on. I don't know what, there's really not a huge difference between 21 and 18, but maybe there would have been to Solomon. I don't know, but she's fudging upwards at this time until she meets Tony. So her and Solomon evidently made it quite a bit. Again, no information about that, but they stayed together for an extended period, and they would have a daughter named, it's like Christiana. She would go by Chris or Little Susie. I'm going to call her Chris throughout this thing. So Chris is Susan's daughter, but Chris was born in 1950. And there is no record of when Susan and Solomon officially divorced. I don't know if they were just separated, but Chris, during interviews, she makes it sound like she grew up with just her mom. And she mentioned being like 9 or 10 and being with her mom, and her mom would take her around to churches, and she'd call it doing a church, quote unquote. And her mother would go to a church. She knew the pastor. She had been there before. And she would give these just very touching testimonies of her faith and her walk with Jesus. And they were absolutely not honest. Chris says they were not honest testimonies. Sometimes her mom would talk about how her and Chris had been in Mexico preaching to people. And obviously Chris was like, that's not true. We weren't anywhere. So Susan would discuss about her spiritual journey with Jesus. And she would kind of put Chris in her nice little dresses and such, and her cute littleness, and make her sing hymns, and then people would give them offerings for doing this. And then this is how she remembers her mother making her money. So this is what she did. And again, she called it, quote unquote, doing a church. So they would do this, to get money and survive. So she did say her mother just had an incredible knack for getting attention. Like she was just very, she walked in the room like she looked. And I can't say Susan is a striking woman. I don't know. She definitely she definitely presented well, evidently. She liked to dress nice. She wore the makeup, did her hair up, all that stuff. And she had that blonde, like not the style of it, but very, very blonde Marilyn Monroe type hair. So the hair was definitely eye-catching for sure. But Chris kind of would state that her mother was a con artist, and she was just very good at that. And that's just how she made her money. So Chris would also recount that her mother went to LA initially because she hated Arkansas and wanted to be an actress. And then her mother ended up, according to Chris, as what was called a B girl. This was where the girls would come in and they were paid by like a bar. And the pretty girl would sit there at the bar, and the bartender would actually serve the girl like tea, water, nothing. They would make it look like an actual alcoholic drink. But the B girl's job was to sit there and connect with these men customers and have these men buy them these so-called alcoholic beverages all night. And then the bar would make tons of money off of that, when really it was like tea. It was nothing. But that was the point of the girl being there, and that was how she got paid. So I couldn't find any documentation on this is like a proof, but this does very much align with the fact that Solomon's career was a bartender. So that kind of aligns. And yeah, I can see, definitely Susan being a B girl, a little pretty woman all done up, sit at the bar and get men to pay for drinks. So Susan, during the time of Chris's raising, would kind of push Chris to sing at the churches. Like Chris was kind of the front person there to her con, and they would, perform and such. And Susan really wanted for Chris to have a singing career. Like that was her end all be all goal. They're living in Los Angeles, and she had wanted to be an actress. So of course she wants her daughter to make it big. So one day Chris is about 15 years old, and she remembered that her mom and her went to a bar called Aldo's in Hollywood. And Susan would normally go to these places to con men into purchasing her a drink, paying for her evening out, getting money from them, whatever. She's trying to meet men with money. Well, Susan always, like Chris says, Susan always looked and presented herself the very best. She was very polished, and the nice clothes and the jewelry and just the works. And well, the person that they ended up meeting at this particular bar on this particular night was also a con artist, and it would be Tony Alamo. And I guess not Chris, but Susan had kind of heard Tony talking to other people, and he was blabbering on about how he was famous and it was a record producer and he had a hit record. So she thinks, oh my, this is it. I can arrange for him to get a career going for Chris, and he's got money and blah, blah. Well, it turns out that neither one of them had the money to even, pay for the beer, Chris said, that night. So whatever happened that night between them, they did hit it off. I guess con woman meets con man, and they con loved. So whatever, but they were in love. And evidently I did find information that said that Tony, right around 1966, before he married Susan, went to jail on a weapons charge. So maybe she bailed him out and then they got married. But anyway, in 1966, he and Susan did get married. They went over to Nevada for some reason to do it. And both of them, even though they're going by their alleged names, both of them actually had to file under their other names. So it's really weird. So anyway, so they've got all these aliases again, because really she should have been legally Lipowitz, but I don't think she was legally Susan Lipowitz or Sue Lipowitz. So anyway, but Susan did start to teach Tony about the Bible, and together they would begin kind of their con at evangelizing to kind of the hippie, movement children out in West Hollywood. And Susan was actually the one that did the preaching. So she was the one with the connection to Jesus, the Bible. She knew the Bible. She had grown up, in the church or whatever. And she would do the preaching, and she literally would stop and preach to the people on the streets. And she really did connect to the people. I think she really did believe, I think she did have faith for sure in Jesus, but she saw the con in it too. She saw this was a work for her as well. And unfortunately, she would do a lot of lying about her so-called testimonies, which would make that false. But her true position, like, she came off very, very real, very, yes, like she believed. So people felt, even after even people that knew that they were con artists would say that they really did truly feel like Susan believed what she was saying. Like, she did have that quality about it. But they were basically preaching to these hippie children who are just looking for some type of community. A lot of, this is the 60s. It's kind of that flower power hippie. A lot of young people not really knowing what they're into. A lot of people wanting to kind of get into communities and just be a part of something, or just be these kids were just needing direction. So, but they were saving these people, they were saving their souls, and they were literally baptizing them in the ocean. So there was even footage of them taking these young people and having baptisms there. And Tony was right along with Sue. Like, he didn't necessarily have any of that background, Bible knowledge, or anything like that, but he was right along with her. He did have the same charisma, so to speak. So Chris stated that her mother was really the real leader of this ministry, and really Tony was just extra baggage along for the ride. And of course, this is coming from Chris, who absolutely hates Tony. So, and you'll find out all that in, there's more to come. So as they would preach and save people, of course, they're also taking their offerings, and they begin to build up a following off of these, these offerings and these children and these followers. So, and of course, Tony bought into it because he could totally see the potential money. So something about Tony was he was a good business person. So she's the front person. She's the leader. She's really the, evangelical, I don't know, person here. But Tony is the business. And like I said, he was charismatic. He wanted to be a singer. He was a performer. He kind of knew how that worked. So, but he could definitely see how all these donations and offerings was like, cha-ching. He just saw dollar signs from these people. And I think he even commented like, why are we messing with these, people? And she was like, well, they need Jesus. So again, Susan had more of a little bit more of an actual heart in this, if you can call it that. So by 1969, they did actually officially form the Tony and Susan Alamo Foundation. And they made it into a ministry. And of course, they did that so they would be tax exempt. They'd be protected from having to pay taxes on this income. And they did purchase like a 3-bedroom house on the corner of Crescent Heights and Sunset in West Hollywood. And this was where they were doing a lot of their recruiting and would continue to recruit out of Hollywood. But they would be passing out tracts. They'd be enlisting anyone that would listen to them. And of course, it's a lot of younger people. It's a lot of people that are, having issues with drugs and alcohol, and they're saving their souls, and they are, bringing these people in and turning their lives around. So that is happening. And at the same time, so these people, and also they're all about communal living. So they're taking in these people and saying, come on, you can just stay. Like, you can just stay with us. So all of these people are gathering, they're eating, they're living in this small house here in West Hollywood. And the following was getting large, like about 200 or so. And so, of course, the authorities are starting to notice this. The police are coming around, the sheriff's department, because of just the sheer amount of people going in and out of this house. And then so the sheriff and everything are coming by to check on things. Well, Susan hated the authorities. She hated them poking into what they're doing. She didn't want them to know what they were doing, and she just had a very strong dislike for the West Hollywood Sheriff's Department, it said. So another factor that was being noticed is that they really were living in unsanitary conditions, because there were too many people trying to live in this house. And then, of course, they're violating just a billion codes, that the city had in place, like housing codes. So knowing this was a huge problem, Susan wanted out of town. She wanted a place out of the city where the police could not be so involved in what they were doing and always checking on them and giving them citations and everything. So they did purchase some land out in what's called Mint Canyon. I'm going to be also referring to this place as the Saugus. I think it's Saugus property. This is going to be their original first property that they land on. And this property was about 45 minutes or so outside of Hollywood. And the followers would actually move into the property, and then in order to become a part of the foundation, they would sell all their earthly goods they had, and then they would donate all the money from selling their stuff and give it to the foundation. And they're being told, they're going to have a place to live, they're going to be taken care of, that they don't need these earthly belongings. All they need is Jesus. And so they're going to be taken care of. And then all day they're going to study the Bible. They're going to also become teachers or whatever the Alamos need in the foundation themselves. So it's just, yeah. So Sue would claim in interviews, as they're growing, reporters and everything, they're getting attention, and they would talk to reporters, but she would claim in interviews during this time that these people had absolutely no money or belongings, that they were all just young hippies. And so basically she was trying to make it look like they were taking all these kids in as a charity. The church was a charity, and really even Chris would recount that, she'd be 18 or 19 by this time, that most of these people coming in did have a lot of funds. They did have a lot of things. They had cars, they had things, and then they would sell these things, and all the money would go to the Alamo Foundation. So, yeah, and she said a lot of them were not poor and destitute. So, yeah, and they were just handing everything they had over to to the Jesus. They were giving to a higher power. So in their heads, that's what they were doing. So additionally, the followers would work full-time jobs. They would pick cotton, they would pick grapes, they would pick roses, just doing whatever job they could get. And then as soon as they would receive their paycheck, so they would sign their paycheck over to the foundation. And so one of the ex-members talked about, if they were making $250 or $500 or whatever they were making monthly, and there were hundreds of them. So this was the amount of money that was being given over to the Alamos. And they, were definitely not sleeping communally with these people. They would always have their own place. They would have very nice things, and yeah, so they always lived at a much higher situation than their followers. And the members themselves were sleeping about 20 to 30 to a home, if really not a whole lot more. And like I said, the Alamos always had a very nice home set up that was just them, and that was kind of their home office where they slept, and then there would be different houses. So it's like they had this acreage, and then there would be different buildings set up for different needs. And of course, they were not intermingling themselves with necessarily their followers or whatever. They would very much, degrade the followers though. So the followers, Susan would always tell them how lazy they were, that they weren't good enough, they weren't working hard enough, that they needed to work harder, that they needed to work harder for Jesus, that was the only way they were getting in heaven. And she would always degrading them. And then also, so these people were, they're living communally, they're having babies. The living conditions were pretty bad. So they didn't have tons of water. They didn't have a bunch of space. These babies that they were having, like they had cloth diapers and they would need water to wash them out. Well, they didn't have a lot of water. They didn't have enough water to do this. And so Susan was always, kind of talking down to these mothers, telling them how filthy their babies were. And really, it wasn't like they wanted their babies to be filthy, but they really did not live in the type of situation that they could adequately take care of these babies and get them clean. So it was just, but they would get berated for it, but yet Susan was responsible for the way these people were living. So I don't want to victim shame or make fun of anyone in a cult. I cannot imagine it. It's very hard for me to imagine. Anywho, but I don't like to follow directions. I like to color outside the line. So I'm like, I don't think I'm a good candidate for it. But anyway, the followers, on the other hand, were so very trusting the Alamos. And of course, they're in this. They are very much believing every single thing that the Alamos are telling them. And they are told that only God speaks to the Alamos and that they are prophets of God and that only they can save them. So, and there's constant sermons. So Susan is constantly giving these sermons, throughout the years. And one of the things, and like I said, and Chris would say, she was constantly kind of not telling the truth in her testimonies. And there were years and years that she would say that she was fighting cancer. And Chris said that she absolutely was lying. She did not have cancer. She wasn't fighting cancer, but she would have, like for years and years and years, have the congregation always continuously praying for her. And according to Chris, she would, she was faking this. And, we're kind of, I guess at this point, I'm going to go along with this because there's more in the future to get to. But anyway, so she, she would tell her followers, that she was healed and that they could heal her and that she had divine healing because she had faith and because she was a prophet. And again, this would go on for years and years as part of Susan's testimony. And in the meantime, she would have all these young people in constant prayer for her. Well, she would turn around and grab Chris up and they would drive, their Cadillac that they always had, the nicest of the nice, and they would go into Hollywood. And Susan always wanted the most expensive clothes, and she would want to go to the most expensive places. She wanted to go to Neiman Marcus to shop and Saks. She wanted the nicest. So she would be buying up, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on clothes while people are back at the, compound praying for her and her, so-called cancer or whatever. So yes, so this was kind of one of the things that Chris remembered. So Tony's kind of largest role, I would say at this time, was that he and Susan would actually broadcast their shows. They would broadcast like their sermons and shows on radio and television. And of course, he being the singer, performer, so he was singing and performing, and Susan was giving her sermons and and I don't know, I'll be posting pictures of them. She kind of had that very Marilyn Monroe blonde platinum hair. And he really looked like a cross between Elvis and Johnny Cash to me. I don't know. He was always wearing dark sunglasses. He had the jet black hair. He definitely did not look the part of any pastor I've ever known in my life. Not to say that a pastor has to look a certain way. They do not. But he definitely looked like he wanted to be a rock star. Yeah, definitely. So it's interesting. But again, so this is the 60s and 70s that this is going on. And so cults were actually becoming a huge problem. And of course you had, you've got cult problems like Jim Jones, and you had the whole Manson situation in the late 60s. So you have a lot of cults, and you have a lot of people coming off of the Summer of Love and this drug, and they're looking for answers, and they're just they're desperate people and they're being taken advantage of. So there were attorneys that were actually practicing law just to help survivors of cults. And they actually had like kind of a national practice set up for dealing with like cult related issues, in law. So just kind of a little side note there. Also, the media was very aware of cults and cult problems, and in fact, people were concerned about it. And in 1973, a reporter with Rolling Stone magazine actually came out. His name was Tim Cahill. So he wanted to actually do a story, on the Alamo Foundation, but he wanted to do it from within. So he was just kind of wandering up and down the streets of Hollywood there, and along came, an Alamo ministry bus, and literally it's like a bright blue bus. I'll try to post, and it's just driving around and it's picking up these young people, and basically they ask them if they want to go, talk about Jesus. And so he gets on the bus, and then they drive him out to the compound. So he goes out there, and it actually, he said, was kind of a week or so leading up to Easter. And he said in his interview that, again, Susan was very believable in her sermons when she spoke, to the people, and there were hundreds of people out there. And he said what he also witnessed, though, was that there was 125 people sleeping in one room. So they have horrible, living arrangements on this compound. And he said there was absolutely no shower ability, zero, water with that many people, and the food was terrible. He just said the food was terrible. He said there was never any beatings that he witnessed when he went out there. But again, it was, because there were rumors. He had heard the rumors about beatings going on at this time, that the people were being beaten, but he didn't see any of that. And evidently he did tell him his identity, so they were aware that he was press, because Chris did mention later on that, when reporters or anyone came out to the property, they would all do they were all on their best behavior and would only show just the good side of everything. And this really kind of reminded me personally of like the Jim Jones, how he would have reporters out and just talk about, he would have everybody put on their happy face, and, in the next minute he's having them drink the punch. So anyway, yes. So there's that. Now, the Alamos did allow for their members, so this was a little bit different from some cults. They did allow their members to communicate with their families. However, they only allowed them to talk to their families if their families were like on board with the foundation and such, like basically giving the foundation good press and coming on their radio or television shows to discuss that, because there were several members that did come in that were addicted to drugs or alcohol that would actually get clean, and so their family was initially thrilled about this, and so they were very happy that they had, found, the Alamo ministry, and that they were now clean, because that's what they could see. So as long as the families were on board and part of, the church, even if they were not living on the compound per se, the members could talk to them. Now, if they had any families that were against the foundation or did not believe in the church or what the church was saying, then they would have to cut off all communication period with them. So that's a little bit different, because most of the time the cults, regardless of how the families feel, they want to isolate them, I guess, for control issues. But yeah, they felt like they had pretty good control. So they were like, yeah, you can talk to your family as long as everybody's on board. And they really, I will say, Tony and Susan were very, very smart in the fact that they knew how to like get more followers and use press and use the TV and use the radio. So they were not stupid. Obviously, cult leaders are very devious people. But within the foundation, the Alamos did break up families kind of within. So there was some brothers that were interviewed, and they were kind of immediately just segregated. For some reason, they would, break up families within the compound. So I guess maybe just more of a control issue, or they didn't want them to have maybe that much of a connection with someone there, because I will say once you form strong connections, then you can kind of start to take over, have your own ideas or whatever. But they did see that as a problem, so they would break up families within, like brothers and sisters and so forth. So Susan and Tony were in control, full control of everyone. Susan would tell the mothers that once their children were actually too old to spank, then they needed to begin slapping them across the face. Yes. And they had to do this on command whenever, the people that are dictating these type of punishments, beating, so forth, were Susan and Tony, and they had to slap them as hard as possible. And they really preached heavily on how the children would go to hell if they weren't severely punished. And obviously, Susan and Tony were always using the threat of hell in everything. You were going to hell for any little thing, but for anything, and basically it wasn't necessarily Bible driven, it was the Alamos driven. You're going to hell because you're not listening to me type thing. So kind of likewise at the Saugus property, they did have this little room off the back of the church, and they basically had it where they sent the devil-possessed children, and they would have the children put there to have the devil beat out of them. And the parents were being made to do these beatings, or the parents were told if they didn't beat the children, then someone else would beat the children and them. So either way, people were getting beat. And as always, the purpose of this was to keep everyone from going to hell. So lots of beatings, lots of children being beaten. There's not a lot of indicators about just people getting beaten at this time, at least. All of the focus of the beatings seemed to be on the children. Now, Chris knew everything. She was living in her mom's house. She was living kind of a little bit, obviously, better than everybody else. But she knew everything about the beatings. She knew about the beatings. Her own mother had beaten her pretty good when she was growing up, as far as, punishments, I guess, just part of the norm. And, Chris, as she's becoming a mother herself, she really wanted to protect her own children. So she did tell her mom when she was about 20 that, and this would be about 1970, that she wished to leave. And her mom told her, "You know way too much, so I'll kill you before I let you go." And this is according to Chris. And Chris does write a book. I did not read the book. I saw many of her conversations from the book was in this other thing that I found. So anywho, but this is from Chris. So Susan did have Chris beaten. So after Susan knew she was wanting to leave, she had some of the men members, beat Chris and then take her kids away from her. So then Chris goes to the police. So she tells them what's going on, and then the police let her go in and get her oldest child, but her youngest child, so the father of the youngest child was actually a member in the foundation, so the police couldn't remove that child because the child was with the dad. So while at the police station, Chris states that she got a phone call from an attorney of the ministry that told her if she didn't file any type of complaint or report at the police department, that she could come and get her youngest child. So she did agree to do that. She is met by Sue there, according to Chris, and says that I warned you. And so Chris was super concerned for her safety. She does leave. She gets out. She takes her kids. She's constantly fearful for her life and her children's lives. And so Chris just says right afterwards, she just moves around a lot. She just keeps moving, hoping that her, mom or Tony don't find her. So after Chris leaves the foundation, others in the foundation were not allowed to talk to Chris. They're not allowed to talk of Chris. If they do, they will get in serious trouble. Like, she's kind of dead to them. So Sue and Tony, after Chris left, they really used their television show and their preaching to the other members about the sin of leaving the foundation and leaving the compound and being cast out to hell. So basically, Chris is going to hell, her kids are going to hell. This is what they're preaching to the people, and they're just really scaring the members to keep the members. They don't want anyone else leaving. So the foundation is just getting bigger and bigger. It's getting more and more members. And obviously with that, the authorities start to get suspicious because other people talk, like neighbors of this compound out in the Saugus area. They're paying attention. People are paying attention. We try not to be nosy neighbors, but you know what your neighbors are up to, whether you think you know or not. You kind of know what's going on around you. You are aware. So this is kind of what's going on. People are becoming aware. The authorities are kind of watching out now. So, and also the income was becoming suspiciously large for the foundation, and the authorities were starting to suspect that members were not getting to keep their wages. Like, they were like, what's going on? This is weird. So now the Labor Department in the state of California and the IRS are asking questions and closely looking at everything and closing in on this. So kind of to get out from under this scrutiny, and because the Alamos feel that they're closing in, they tell their members, we need to move. We need to build a big new church in the actual Bible Belt. And so Susan, of course, she was born in Alamo, Arkansas. She knew the lay of the land in Arkansas, and this is what they decided to do. They decided to stretch out and build a new church in Arkansas. So they would call this big move, it was to go to the so-called Promised Land. So this would be their move to the Promised Land. So Susan would testify that she was healed there in Arkansas when she was 9 years old by churchgoers because she had tuberculosis, which is very interesting because, of course, that was the same disease that killed her dad when she was just 2. And of course, she would have never have really remembered her dad or anything. But, I guess she kind of alleged later on that he just abandoned the family. But anyway, she's very interesting. But she did testify. And so she gets their members pumped about this prospect of Arkansas. Bible Belt, beautiful land, tons of people to heal you. This is what they're going to do. So in 1975, they're kind of beginning this exodus from California and going on this new adventure in Arkansas. And and this is kind of based on articles and such, but it looks like they kind of first settled in Fort Smith area of the state to kind of begin with. And they kind of purchased some property there. And then they do kind of right away purchase about 200 acres or so in an area 6 miles to the northeast of Alma, Arkansas, which is where she was from. And then it's 1 mile north of this very small town called Dyer. So to kind of give you some ideas here. So the Alamos would build a whole new house compound structure on this land, the situation. And in fact, they would build a 13,000 square foot home on this land, and then tons of outbuildings for all their various operations. They would even build a heart-shaped pool, a concrete pool that you can literally still see on maps. If you pull up this property today, you can see it on maps. But the property would be a gated property. It'd have 2 entrances in and out, and it was very secure or whatever, and being monitored all the time. So, and they would also post no trespassing sign. So Alma's population isn't huge, but it's not tiny. Dyer is tiny. It's like got 1,000 people. It is a real city, but it is 1,000 people. And Alma's like 10,000. So it's 10 times as big. Now, Fort Smith, which is even bigger, is 20 miles to the west. And to kind of give some people that are not from around here, so this area is the very western part of Arkansas, so central and west Arkansas. And this area of Fort Smith is on Interstate 40, so it kind of can quickly connect. The authorities felt like they landed there initially because you could quickly get to Oklahoma. You could quickly get to Texas from Interstate 40. And so this Fort Smith area was like a real crossroad situation. And it is a smaller situation. So they really needed to get away from California. They needed to get away from the scrutiny, and this area just really served that. And Chris felt like, her mom knowing this area really well was another factor in them moving there. But this is what they decided. So I will say, on a little side note, I am going to be headed to Fort Smith. And Fort Smith is about 3 hours from where I live, but in the state. But I will be speaking at an event in April, so more details to come. It is a ticketed event, so I'll keep you guys posted, but I'm very excited about it. So anyway, so this property, we will call it it was called kind of the Dyer, I think it's Dyer, Dyer property. It's spelled Dyer, or the Georgia Ridge property also. So if you hear me say Dyer property, hear me say the compound at Dyer, Georgia Ridge. This is the area. Georgia Ridge was kind of the area. And then the actual house, and you can look at it, it's like 2604 Harmony Road, and it does have an Alma, Arkansas address. But it is very close to Dyer. The foundation kind of immediately got to work on engaging in for-profit businesses. So actual businesses in the area of Alma. They would also, in fact, they would build very profitable businesses. And because obviously they have workers working for free and working hard and working long hours. And so they just began to grow. They had holding companies formed. They had offshore accounts and corporations formed. So they're really trying to hide as much as they can from the IRS. Like, they're really trying to have legitimate businesses set up, but they also, of course, have a lot of money being funneled through the foundation, which is tax exempt. So they would actually be showing the for-profit companies as losses on paper, but then the IRS, of course, is watching all this. So the IRS is watching the foundation go from like 46,000 income in a year to $1 million. So basically, all the real companies that are really drawing in the income is, basically showing zero income, and then they funnel it through the foundation. So they, again, wouldn't pay taxes. Anyway, it's crazy. So in 1976, the Labor Department would actually file suit against the foundation for lack of wages being paid. And this would really be a legal battle going back and forth until 1985. So just in the back of your head, think, the Labor Department is after them. They're really wanting to somehow stop whatever's going on. It's like they know that a lot's going on. They're just trying to stop it. So in the meantime, the compound was kind of being watched. Like, Tony and Susan had people watched, and they still have the set. So even though they moved to Arkansas, just FYI, they keep the Saugus property. It's still a ministry. It's just they move the bulk of the people out to Arkansas. Okay. So basically, Tony's having everybody monitored all the time. The members are never alone. They never have downtime. I mean, literally, these people, if they're working in the businesses that the Alamos have, they're working, and we'll get into all these, they're working 12 to 15 hour days. They were allowed to read their Bibles, and then they really wanted them to be listening to the sermon. So they, again, Tony and Susan would preach all the time. They would preach these sermons and they would tape them. And so the people had to use and listen to these tapes. And then also these tapes were being sent all over the country, really. So there was more followers that were sending in money, not necessarily just the compound people. They also would not allow them to use birth control. The Alamos encouraged lots of children because they really felt like if they did take control of the kids. So if they had the kids, they had the adults, and they had more control over the adults to keep them. And so it was just like a very smart thing that Tony and Susan did, and just kind of another mind game being played on the actual members. So the kids actually were told to call Tony Papa Tony, and whenever reporters or anyone would come around, he would make a big show of how happy the children were, how adjusted, and blah blah. And again, they're still using media. They've got a lot of propaganda. They still send out flyers. It's just all these things. So the Alamos were really the acting parents. I mean, they kind of controlled everything. In fact, they had the children sleeping in a particular house that they called the spec house, and they stated that it was for tax purposes. Now, I don't know who they were stating it to. I don't know if they were telling the parents, okay, the kids have to sleep over here. I don't know, but the kids were together, and the parents were just kind of over here, and Tony and Susan were completely in control of the situation. I don't know. So anyway, I can't, again, it's just really hard for me to imagine. So listening to this, so Tony and Susan did require all of the members to report to them. They wanted written up, just kind of people telling on themselves, I guess, but they wanted write-ups when anybody did any type of sin. So you're supposed to write up everybody. So you had parents writing up kids, you had kids writing up parents, you had people writing up about themselves. They were talking about their own sin. So they were constantly writing these reports, and then Tony and Susan would receive these reports. So they always knew what was going on. They could always be involved in the punishment for the sin that was committed. It just was a way for them to keep tabs on every single thing that was going on with the members, and to keep the members in line and keep control. So it's just another control situation. This is all about control. So it will say, so everything, going on within, like I said, is totally in the Alamo's control. So even when they weren't at the location, like when they traveled or whatever, which they did travel, and we'll kind of get into that. So, and because at this time and again, like I said, they still have the Saugus property. So this is going on. They have members doing the same thing out in California that they're doing here, and they were expanding. So they had other ministries set up in like New York, Chicago, Oklahoma. So they were setting up satellite churches in other places, not just the compound in Arkansas, just FYI. So lots of things going on in the ministry as the ministry grew and made money and such. So yes. So the people in Arkansas kind of knew right away that the foundation appeared to be a cult. As soon as they kind of moved in. So the people in the Alma area, the Dyer area, they were like, I mean, it's small, and they're taking notice. And just the fact that there's communal living going on, there's this big house that they erected, there's no trespassing signs, this was kind of on people's radar. Yeah. So the rumor mill was a buzz. I mean, even in like my town, Searcy, I mean, there's 24,000. It is, and that's not huge by any means, but that's bigger than these areas. And they're, if people came in, moved in, and all, built this huge compound, people would be talking. You'd probably be hearing about it on Facebook. Let's be honest. So I can only imagine like what was being said, and especially if the people knew and were being like, oh, there's people that moved in from California. Ugh. This was the 70s when they were coming, and they would immediately thought cult or something strange. This is coming off of all the terrible things, the Manson murders in 69, like, there's just a lot of cult related things going on. So people were on high alert. So Susan and Tony, kind of knowing the situation, they weren't stupid. They knew that they were being kind of scrutinized by the community. So they did begin sending out pamphlets, kind of reflecting very wholesome, normal pictures of the children, like riding horses, swimming, having fun. They called these foundation books, and then they would distribute these around, and they were really trying to manipulate everyone and just trying to, be like, oh, look, we're normal, so-called, even though they were far from it. So in an interview, a former editor actually of the Southwest Times Record, which was a paper in this area, the Fort Smith, Alma area, he stated that the Alamos were actually well accepted because some of the businesses that the Alamos had going on, like they owned a restaurant called the Alamo Restaurant, they owned a store, they owned the service station in town, like there was literally not a lot of places in Alma that people could go that weren't owned by the Alamos, actually. They were always well dressed. They drove around in Cadillacs. They appeared to, have a lot of money. And then, of course, they really were looking like and living like they were celebrities. I mean, that's what they were doing. And they really kind of were for the area. And we'll kind of get into this. But they were very active. They still had their TV program. And so that kind of made them celebrity of sorts. And yeah, so it was weird. They even had a program. There was a program that I saw that they did from like the Grand Ole Opry. So they did a show from the Grand Ole Opry even. So they were very well accepted. Yeah, so it's very interesting. But to kind of solidify their standing, and kind of, I don't know, make themselves look good, make their restaurant look good and such. So they would bring in huge country stars to sing at their restaurant in Alma. It was very popular people like Brenda Lee, Dolly Parton herself, Tammy Wynette, Hank Williams Jr., and Roy Orbison. In fact, President Clinton, who was then governor, so he would actually come to the restaurant, and he would state that Tony Alamo reminded him of Roy Orbison on speed. I don't know who Roy Orbison is, but I guess he looked like Tony Alamo, which kind of looks to me like, Johnny Cash-ish. So these were really the good years for the Alamos. They were living in style. Their foundation was huge. They had a lot of money. Like things were going extremely well for them. This was their quote unquote heyday. In 1981, the Alamos launched a second television program to showcase their Christian community in an effort to grow their followers who weren't necessarily living in the commune, but of course still sending to their foundation, because a lot of people were watching, church, quote unquote, on TV at that time. They did have, television evangelists going on. So they were just another one of these things. So basically the Alamos were extending their reach to like more of like a national level. So within the community itself, the children were terrified of the Alamos. So Tony and Susan would, be responsible for punishing the children. Tony had his upper management followers make special paddle board, and they would call it the quote unquote board of education. And it looked like awful. It was basically like a horrible contraption. It kind of reminded me of in the movie Dazed and Confused, when you have the senior, the would-be seniors going around paddling the freshmen. And I mean, these boars they were huge paddles. He had like holes in them. I mean, basically just to inflict as much pain on these kids as possible. I mean, it's downright disgusting. In 1981, so, after years and years and years of Chris alleging that Susan, had faked cancer, now Susan did find out in 81 that she had breast cancer. And Chris said that Susan was just shocked. She was absolutely shocked when she actually did have the cancer. They did try to go in and perform a surgery, but they did find that the cancer had metastasized and it was everywhere. So there was really nothing that could be done. I guess she was definitely stage 4. It doesn't really say, and I never found like an official death certificate. But there is some discrepancy here because in some articles that I found, it did state that Susan did originally get a cancer diagnosis or maybe found some type of cancer in 1975. And now in 1981, this breast cancer was stage 4. So I don't know the real story. I mean, according to Chris, Susan's daughter, she had lied this whole time. So maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But anyway, I don't know. She did actually have cancer though. So Tony is completely freaking out about the cancer. I mean, obviously he's upset because it's his wife, Susan, but he just didn't know what he was going to do with the foundation. I mean, Susan was really the leader of the church, in which, speaking of members, they kind of started to notice how sick Susan was because she wasn't even well enough to go to church. I mean, it kind of took her very quickly. It says that she kind of found out about it by 1981 and literally on April 8th of 1982. So Susan did pass away from the cancer, and she would have been 60. So her real age was 60. However, like I said, her burial information states that she was born in 1925 instead of 1922. So again, it's strange. And I will say there's a lot more strange to come. But Tony was heartbroken. He was scared. He didn't have a clue how he would keep all of the foundation in check and keep the members in line. So he came up with a plan. So he refuses to bury Susan after her funeral. Yes. So instead, he turns a portion of their home into kind of her, prayer vigil room, puts her casket in, puts her in there. I mean, it's half open. Like, I guess he keeps it like that, just like when someone's, at their funeral. And so he tells the members that he wants a prayer vigil going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until she is risen from the dead. Yes. So her body is laid out, ready to be risen. And they go ahead and do like 2-hour shifts. So the members do 2-hour shifts. And so 24/7, there's continuous pray over Susan. So Tony would, tell the members that Susan was actually sending him messages during this time, like straight from the Lord. So this was kind of his way of maybe dealing with his own grief or dealing with trying to keep everybody in line, just to keep them busy maybe, or keep them, I don't know, but just everything he can do to keep the members in check. This is what he's doing. So he's still in control. They're still giving money. And literally a full year goes by and Susan's body is still not buried. So it's still sitting in the house and they are still praying for her to come back. This is where I'm going to leave you in part 1. Okay, guys? So part 2 will pick up in 1982. At this same spot. So yeah, so this was a lot of information. We'll write it like an hour or so. I just didn't want to like Christmas killer you again. But anyway, so stay tuned for part 2. So this part 1 will be out Monday, January 13th. And then I will release part 2 Thursday, whatever day Thursday is. I don't have a calendar in front of me. I don't know. The 16th? Is Thursday the 16th? I don't know, guys. Anyway, so stay tuned. And I really love you guys. This one's really it gets worse. I will say that. It gets worse with Tony after Sue's death, but we'll get into it. So it's just a lot of weird. and a lot of bad, and I just don't like Tony. So anyway, all right, guys. Well, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you soon. Love ya. Bye.
Unexplained Arkansas.